These are some of the knit patterns and knitwear that I have created. I'm sitting here with my latest design, which is called the Pride and Pearls cardigan. And all of these things I write knit patterns for. And in this video, I want to talk about how to read a knitting pattern, because maybe you're curious about knitting, maybe you've been knitting for a while and you're curious maybe to take it up a notch, or maybe you're very beginner and haven't actually ventured into knitting yet. One thing that you will encounter is knitting patterns. And that being said, they can be a bit intimidating. And honestly, a bit is maybe an understatement. They can be super overwhelming. And there's just lots of abbreviations used. There are numbers, brackets. It's just like a whole cryptic, very exclusive club that you're only allowed to in if you know this very secret language. But I'm hoping that with this video, I am going to make you see that actually it's not at all that difficult or complicated. Okay, granted, maybe it takes a little bit of patience first, but I'm hoping that in this video I can kind of show you that it's really not that scary as it first might seem. There's like a lot of things to take into consideration when choosing a knit project, which can be, well, slightly off-putting if you're new to knitting, from how to choose a good pattern, how to choose your yarn, your needles, what is tension and gauge even mean. Like, there's lots of questions. So I want to kind of break it down. And even if you've been knitting for a while, I'm hoping that there's going to be some helpful tips for you in this video as well. I have decided to divide this video into two parts. So part one, we're going to talk more about how to choose your pattern and talk about that first page, which is usually a page with some information about the pattern, including like size, finished garment measurements, yarn, needle, etc. And in the second part of this video, we're going to talk about some of the common abbreviations used in most knit patterns. So I'm going to be showing you what exactly that abbreviation is. And I'm hoping that this is then a video that maybe you can come back to, especially if those abbreviations aren't very familiar to you. You can use this as a video and come back to it time and time again, especially part two. Now, you might be wondering, who am I to talk about knit patterns? Well, I learned a lot about knitting patterns and writing knitting patterns when I was making my book, Knit This. For this book, I worked with a technical editor, so that's usually what you use when you do a knit pattern. And my first, I feel very like a professor or something. My first knit pattern that I've published myself was back in 2013. I had a look at it sometime. That knit pattern is definitely more of an amateur pattern, and I've been knitting ever since I was a child. Obviously followed lots of knitting patterns. I myself learned to knit from my grandmother, from magazines and books. Back when I was a teenager and as a child, YouTube wasn't around. I wish it would have, because it would have been so much easier to learn a lot of things. But that's kind of where I'm coming from, and I've worked with lots of different tech editors by now, done different patterns, had them test knitted by lots of knitters. So I've also received lots of comments and feedback about my patterns. So I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of what kind of most knitters like in a pattern. But I'm hoping that in this video at least we can cover the basics, and then there might be some small variations, but that's where I'm coming from, and that's a little bit about my history with knitting patterns, and hopefully will give me some credibility to make a video like this. Okay, let's dive into this. So part one, let's talk a little bit about overall a knit pattern, what you can expect. So first of all, how to choose your knit pattern and how to find a good knit pattern. This usually stems from a desire that you've seen something maybe on Instagram or on Ravelry or even on YouTube or in a yarn shop, something that you want to knit. And of course, first is probably a good idea, and you can assess how complicated something is. So for example, something like this is fairly easy, is quite beginner friendly, because as you can see, it's just knitted in Stockinette stitch. A simple top and pretty quick to knit. This is the Oh La La top. And of course, this, if you're looking for more like a beginner-friendly project, something like this, you could be fairly certain that you can probably make that. While as something that would have, for example, more like lace, more details. This is my grandma core hood. It has this tie string here. This, of course, immediately requires a little bit more skills, but still like not a huge project. But then of course something like, you know, very full-on cables, a sweater like this is the Arctic Light sweater. Now of course I do have a video tutorial, so that of course would help. But if you would see something like this, you can expect there to be some charts and lots of different techniques and things to just have in mind. So when you are choosing a project, and if you're looking for something, you know, beginner friendly, it's probably good to choose something that kind of looks quite simple, or even, you know, like a small one. For example, a beanie. This is the Rebel Soul beanie, so something that you can knit fairly quickly. The second question on how to find good knit patterns. Well, different designers have a tendency to write their patterns in different styles. One thing, and this is maybe just my observation, but often I find in knitting magazines, sometimes the patterns are quite short and pretty condensed, which sometimes might mean that if you're not very familiar with knit patterns, they might be pretty difficult, just because there are a lot of things that are sort of written between the lines and maybe aren't written out as clearly as in, for example, an independent knit designer who publishes patterns on, say, Ravelry. Because there you don't have that page space that takes up, you know, it costs money, and that's like very valuable real estate in a magazine because it's a print. So I just find that often, or at least I know my own just experience with writing this book, how many pages, you know, and how big and heavy the book becomes. That was not a concern, but that was like definitely a thing to keep in mind. While as when I made, for example, the Salty Days sweater pattern, that pattern is very long, but that is because I've done it very clearly. Everything is really written out. There are different sections. There's like charts and things, and that might also first look very intimidating, but actually when it's longer, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a more difficult or advanced pattern. Usually what it means is that it's going to be more clear and probably answer more questions along the way, just because everything is written out. So maybe something to keep in mind. I think when it comes to find good knit patterns, you kind of have to try and see what kind of style you like. Often you can also, for example, on Ravelry, you can see people have commented on that pattern. You can be quite certain if a lot of people have successfully completed a pattern that it's a good pattern. You can always, of course, if the designer, if it's from an independent designer, if they have a support email, you can try to ask questions. I know some can't reply to those, and I certainly try. I have Kelsey, my assistant, now also helping with the pattern support, because that is something that I truly want to try to provide, even though sometimes it's a little overwhelming because there's a lot of questions coming in, especially on Instagram. But I have a support email, support@kutovakika.com, where if there is a struggle with a specific pattern of mine, I can't speak for other designers, but with any specific patterns of mine, I try to answer and help as well as I can, and Kelsey is also helping me with that. But I think you have to kind of try and see, and some magazines, and of course there's so many really nice knitting books, and with the knitting book it's good if you go to a store, then you can kind of browse through it. You can even ask the, you know, yarn store owners if they have good recommendations. But I think the most important thing is that it's really something that you want to make, that you feel very motivated to make, because if you can really feel like that excitement, even if it's something that maybe that you're thinking, oh, this is maybe going to be a too complicated project, but if you really want to make it, I think the likelihood that you're going to complete it with a project that you really, really are burning for is higher with a pattern that you really want to make. When you have chosen a pattern, usually what you will see on the first page, there might be some pattern notes, so maybe a little bit of an overview of the workflow. So maybe there talk about the overall construction. So if it's a garment like a sweater, for example, it might say, wait, this is the wrong way, how it's constructed. So this is the wishbone sweater. It is started, or it's worked in the round, and it's beginning from top down. It's knitted top down, which means that you start here with the collar. Then there are two versions in the pattern, a German short row version and just a straight collar version. So I've added that in the pattern notes. And then it kind of breaks it down a little bit, or not all patterns, but some patterns have that. So it's just a nice, like a little overview. You kind of know what you're in for, basically. Usually then on the next page or so, you have all this kind of information. And the first one I want to talk about is yarn. When you have decided to knit something, you of course want to go and get your yarn, or maybe you have some yarn in your stash already that you're looking for a specific project. So in most patterns, it will say what yarn is used. And this, of course, can be substituted. You don't have to use the same yarn. But one thing that is very important is to just check the thickness, or usually we talk about that as weight when we speak about yarns. So usually that is measured per meters or yards per like a ball of yarn, and usually those are 50 grams, depending a little bit, of course, on what kind of yarn it is. But that is something that is very important to take in mind, because then how thick that yarn is, of course, is going to affect the gauge. So that is knitting tension, and that will also affect the needle size. And all these things are connected, so you can't really disregard one from another. So when you're going to a yarn shop, or if you have some yarn, it's good to check that that yarn will work for this project. Another thing to keep in mind with yarn is that, for example, if I would make, well, this wishbone sweater, this is knitted with one strand of heavy merino from Knitting for Olive and one strand of silk mohair. If I would now go and make this project with, for example, a silk yarn or a linen blend yarn, the drape would probably be very different, and the fabric that it would produce would be very different. One hand, that is very cool, and you get to choose what kind of fabric you want to produce. But again, it's worthwhile just thinking about it and, holding in your hand, maybe analyzing a little bit and seeing if, if you've seen, like, for example, a really fluffy mohair dress that you want to knit and you choose a cotton yarn. Those are going to look very different, because the fluffy mohair dress is going to be really airy and light, and the cotton is usually quite heavy. So maybe it's a good idea, if you really, really love like that sample that is shown in the knitting pattern, like the photos, to try to go for a yarn that is similar. Another reason choosing your yarn is so important is because in a knitting pattern, you will also have something called gauge, which means knitting tension. So that is essentially how tightly or how loosely you knit. And usually you want to make like a sample swatch with whatever stitch is mentioned in the pattern. So usually the pattern will also say in what stitch that sample is, or that gauge is. So for example, if it's in stockinette stitch, which means that on all the right side rows you knit and all the wrong side rows you purl, if you're knitting back and forth, so flat. So in stockinette stitch it says, for example, 20 stitches per 10 centimeters or 4 inches. You would of course knit it in stockinette stitch. Sometimes it might be in seed stitch or in some kind of cable stitch. So then you would want to make it in that stitch pattern that the pattern calls for, or the pattern is in. So that is also why yarn is important, and needle size. So you will also usually find a suggested needle size, and like yarn, needle size, gauge, all of these are interconnected, and it's all about producing the fabric that we want for our garment. And that is, I would say, the most important thing. And that is also how we ensure that we get the result that we want. So of course, needle size is always a suggestion, because maybe the knit designer or the person who has written that knit pattern knits much looser or much tighter than you. And often, if like, I would say I'm a fairly like normal, I'm fairly relaxed, but I don't think I knit loosely, definitely not. But I know definitely some knitters who knit very, very tight. So I think I would say like I'm pretty in the middle on the spectrum. And if you kind of know that you're sort of somewhere in between, maybe it's okay, maybe you're kind of safe to go ahead. But if you know that you usually knit quite loosely, you probably want to choose like a smaller needle size. Or if you know that you knit very tight, you probably want to choose a larger needle size for your knit project. And of course, why this matters is because of sizing. So choosing your size, and most knit patterns, they will have the finished garment measurements. This is my stripe pipe sweater. and in the pattern you will find the finished garment measurements for the different sizes. And this is of course something that you are very curious about, especially if it's a garment. Now with accessories it's a little different, and often they might be just one size, but with something like a sweater, this is a little bit oversized, but especially something that is pretty tight fitting, it's pretty important that that measurement is spot on, so that when you put all this work into making something, you don't end up with a size, extra small and it doesn't fit you, or it's huge and, it looks like a tent on you. Which both of these things have happened to me. I've made garments that have been too small and things that have turned out way too big for myself. So this is also why you want to pay attention to this, and I find definitely most helpful knitting patterns that state the finished garment measurements. Sometimes it will also say for like the different sizes. So like a very common is to use, for example, extra small, then small, medium, large, and so forth, or then like just numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4. I think both are really fine, and I understand why you would want to maybe have a number. I just find that sometimes then I have to like think so much, so I just find it easier to use like extra small, small, medium, large. That's what I use in my patterns, and they will also usually be some brackets and some decimal signs between those, and those are also, there's like a reason for that we will get into a little bit later, why it's noted like that. So what I suggest that you would do is grab a measuring tape, and usually it will, for most sweaters at least, it will state bust circumference, because that's usually where we are like the widest on our body. So to measure yourself, you will just take a measuring tape and just wrap it around, usually with maybe just your bra on. Now I have a sweater on, but you get the point. And you would wrap it around and check your measurement and make sure that it's like level, horizontal, so it's not like all wonky, and not keep it too relaxed, but not tighten it either. And then you will see, your measurement, and then you can compare it to the measurements of the finished garment in the pattern. It usually will also say if there's some positive ease. So for example, if I would be, my bust is like 87 centimeters, so I think that's like around 34 inches, a bit plus 34.25 or something like that. So usually I will knit a size small or a medium, but sometimes if I want to have like lots of positive ease, maybe I will choose even a larger size. If I want to have less positive ease, I will choose a smaller size. So hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that gives you some clarity on how to choose the size for your knit pattern. For most knit patterns, you have a workflow that is divided into sections. For example, like front and back, or something like yoke, body, sleeves, and collar, depending a little bit on the construction of the garment or the knit thing accessory that you're knitting. So usually we'll be divided into sections like that. And like I said in the beginning, there might be an overview kind of telling you in what order things are going to happen. And some things with knit patterns that can make it a little bit tricky sometimes is that there might be things that are kind of implied or assumed that a knitter will do without them being explicitly explained. So things like, when to cut the yarn, or when to, or how to, for example, if there's like stripes, how to change the yarn, and things like that. So some things they might not say in the pattern, but usually in those instances, you can trust your own instinct. You can do as you choose to do if there aren't any instructions on that. Like I find that maybe now the trend is more going towards knit patterns that are pretty, I would say, very, very clear, and like every step is really written down. And that's kind of what I try to do as well, without like making the patterns, 100 pages long, of course. Like you need to take into consider also readability to some extent, but usually that's the workflow. And then what happens, most knit patterns are very matter of fact, because I think, as is the case with a recipe, when you're doing something and following an instruction, you just want, the dry facts. You don't want a lot of here and there, like funny anecdotes and things like that. So usually they are very dry and kind of providing only the information necessary. Sometimes that also means that a lot of information is conveyed in very, very tight spaces. Okay, I think that covers almost everything I wanted to say about how to read a knit pattern for this part 1. So more kind of how to decipher all the things that you need and before you can even get started, how to choose your yarns and the patterns. So next we're gonna move into the actual knit pattern language if you want. So I'm going to be covering all of the most common abbreviations, and we're also going to then at the end here, and I'll put timestamps for everything, so you can click the description box here below, so there's a specific one you're interested in. I'll put also timestamps because then in the end we'll look at some examples. So together we'll look at some actual sentences from some knitting patterns of mine, so that you can see it in action and you can see that actually you'll have the key to this mystic secret language and the door to any knit pattern that your heart desires. I hope will be open with this video and you can come back to it. And we're gonna now cover like the most commonly used abbreviations. So I'm not gonna go through all of them because obviously there's a lot, but every time you then stumble upon something that maybe you're not so familiar with, like for example, what does CDD stand for? That's central double decrease. We're not gonna go through things like that in this video. But when you have this video and you've kind of seen how the system works, you can always just Google that, YouTube, plentiful, and most knit patterns also comes with explanations for the abbreviations, but just for convenience, I thought I want to share this with you. So this list of some common knit abbreviations. CO. Sometimes you find this abbreviation used. CO stands for cast on, or usually stands for cast on. Sometimes the pattern will say with what method, because there are different methods of casting on stitches, of course. So it might be with the backwards loop cast on method, which is the one that I'm using here right now. I think this one has different names as well, but this is a very, very commonly used one. And sometimes it might be an Italian cast on method or something else, but usually it will say, and if it doesn't say, usually you're safe to use, for example, this one. Luna got curious and came to visit. This is her tail. One of the most commonly used abbreviations is STS, which stands for stitches. So stitches is of course how many stitches you will have. Sometimes the pattern will say knit across X amount of stitches. So STS or just ST for if it's just one stitch. Another very, very commonly used abbreviation is K, which stands for knit. So when you are just knitting your stitches, usually most patterns will just have the abbreviation K. P stands for purl. So whenever you are purling in a pattern, it will usually just say P instead of purl. So here I am now on the wrong side of this little sample I'm making. So I am just purling all of my stitches. TBL stands for through the back loop. This is usually used when you are creating a rib of some sort. So instead of knitting a loop from the front loop like this, I would instead go in through the back loop here and knit it through the back loop, which would create then a twisted stitch. And this could be done either for a purl or a knit stitch. So TBL stands for knit through the back loop. Right now I am knitting all my right side rows and purling all my wrong side rows, which creates a stitch pattern called Stockinette stitch, and that is abbreviated STST. So STST stands for Stockinette stitch. This was one that took me a long time to at least understand what is going on. RS. RS stands for right side. And this is usually in capital letters. So when you are working flat, which means that you are knitting back and forth, usually it will say row and then the number of the row and then RS in brackets, so that you know that if you're working on the right side or the wrong side of the work. So first of all, there's also a clue in row. That means that you are knitting flat, and those are the kind of things that sometimes maybe it doesn't specify in the pattern. if it's worked in the round or flat, but especially if they are then rows, you know that it's definitely knitted flat. WS, that means wrong side. So then when you are on the wrong side, when you are knitting flat, that is abbreviated with WS. Here is a sweater I'm currently working on, and I'm working on this in the round. So RND or RNDS stands for round or rounds. And in a knit pattern, if you see round and then some instruction, you know that you are knitting in the round because it says round and not row. So that is something that maybe is obvious, but maybe it's not so obvious. So that's just something, one of those things that maybe it doesn't say explicitly in the knit pattern, it's knitted flat or in the round, but because you have that round or row in there, you know if it's knitted flat or in the round. Let's talk about markers. Those are often used and very helpful in knit patterns. So they can sometimes be abbreviated with just an M or a big M. Sometimes you can see BOR M, that stands for beginning of round marker. So when you are knitting in the round, like I did here in my project, I have here a marker that I know where my round changes. So I'm using this kind of marker here. You also have these kind of removable markers that you can use. Of course, you can close them and also use them here, but BOR M, or there are different variations, usually stands for beginning of round. PM stands for place marker. So if it says in the pattern to PM, that means that you want to place a marker on your needle. So then you can always slip this one. And SM stands for slip marker. So let's say you have been knitting here and you come to the spot where the marker is, you would just SM, so slip that marker from the left to the right needle. And lastly, RM stands for remove marker. So maybe the marker isn't needed anymore, RM, so then you can just go ahead and remove that marker from your knit project. Next, let's look at some of the most common decreases. So probably one of the most common ones is K2 tog, which means knit two together. So as if you would knit just one, but you actually go through 2 stitches and knit 2 together. A K2 tog, knit 2 together. Now the counterpart to that one, so a K2 tog always leans towards the right. SSK stands for slip, slip, knit. So in this case, you slip the first stitch as if to knit, but you don't actually knit it, you just slip it. And the second one as well, and it's very crucial that you go in knitwise, so that means that you go in through as if you would knit. So not through here, sorry, there's that, but through here. So you slip these both knitwise, and then you use your left needle, go through both of these stitches, wrap the yarn around, and knit them 2 together, but this time SSK. But this time the SSK leans to the left and the K2 together leans to the right. And this is probably the most common decrease that you'll find in any knit pattern. One very common use of decreases, other than of course shaping garments, is they are used in, for example, lace stitch. So this is the love letter top, which there is a full tutorial here on my YouTube channel. And here I've used K2 togethers and SSKs to produce all of these different patterns or intricate shapes, and then with some yarn overs as well. Next, let's look at some very common increases. Here is just a seam from my cinema sweater, which is a very new sweater that I have been working on and I'm going to release the pattern for. But this has a very visible raglan seam, and this is worked by creating increases, so make one left or make one right. And that's often used when you're shaping, for example, a raglan seam like this or some other shaping of a garment. So let's look at those two. M1R stands for make one right. So that means that you will increase one right. And to do so, you will use the left needle and this strand between here, the stitches. So you can see this top strand here is the one that you want to use. And bring your left needle from behind that strand and pick it up with your left needle. from behind. We're make one right, and then we're gonna knit that in a twisted manner. So we're gonna go in through from the front so that that strand gets twisted on our needle, and we produce a new stitch. And you can see that the strand here has gotten twisted, and we have made one new stitch, so we increased one. M1L, make one left. So similarly to the make one right, we're gonna now make one left leaning instead. And this time I'm gonna again look at that strand between, but this time I'm gonna take my left needle from the front, and that is the big difference here. So I go in from the strand from the front like that. So I get it onto my left needle, and this time again I want to make sure that I get this twisted when I create my new stitch. So I'm gonna knit it now from the back loop when I make one left. Like this, and you can see that the strand is twisted. So we've created one new stitch, increased one, made one left, like this, and it creates a really, really nice increase. One more, yarn over. This is something that is used in a lot of lace stitch patterns, and I just wanted to show you it because it's so simple. Yarn over just basically means that the working yarn, you're just bringing it up and over your right needle and behind. And that is literally it. So then when you continue now to knit, you have that yarn over, so you're basically making a hole, and that is all the yarn over is. So on the next round, or sorry, on the next row, whenever I've created a yarn over, I am just gonna treat it as a regular stitch. So it is an increase, unless then there are some decreases, which is the case with lace stitches, that will then usually have a decrease as well. So here I come to my yarn over, and I'm just gonna purl it as I would regularly, and then you have this little hole in your fabric. Now you could of course also purl that through the back loop, and then it becomes twisted, and then you wouldn't get this hole. So that's another way to use yarn over increases. Charts. One thing you will often find in knitting patterns is of course charts. This is a chart from my knitting book, so I'm not using anybody else's chart here, anybody else's property here. But I just want to say a quick few words about charts. So most charts are usually read from the right to the left, from bottom up. And it will depend a little bit. If it's knitted in the round, all of the rows or the rounds are read from right to left. And you can see all of these little boxes represent one stitch, and then you have some different things happening here in the different stitches, creating this motif. And these gray stitches aren't counted as stitches at all. So you would start here from stitch number 7 and work that until 14, skip all of these, and then you would work 25 to 29. And the reason being is that there are some increases happening here. So later on, this will grow and create that yoke for the ivy sweater. But if, for example, you have a pattern that is worked back and forth, so flat, you will usually read that from right to left on all the right side rows, or usually it starts with the right side row, and then from left to right. And usually the little number will be always at the side where you start the chart from. So I just wanted to kind of show and explain that. And often all of in these charts, you'll always have like a key here. So for all the symbols, what they mean, usually then it's the abbreviation. So you still kind of need to know what it means. But a chart is actually, for that reason, I think really, really nice to have. It's so visual and it's so easy. And usually you can use like Post-it notes to know which row or which round you are on. But I personally love charts. I think they're just really nice, and it just makes it so visible what you are working on. I promised to show you some example of an actual knit pattern, so we're staying with, this is my from my book. So this is called the Ivy Sweater. So it's this pattern that we're now looking at the pattern for. And so you can see here, for example, when it starts, we have a sentence saying CO. So you now know that that is cast on. And then you have all of these different numbers. So these different numbers are for the different sizes. And for this one, there's only 4 sizes because it's very oversized. So that's why you have these different ones. So depending on which size you're working, you would then follow that number. Here is another example. So here you can see now that the different sizes are separated, so that's a bit different, the instructions for the different sizes. So here it says for these sizes you are going to K2 tog, P2 tog, repeat asterisk to asterisk until end of round. And this is something that you'll see in many knit patterns, this little stars or asterisks. So often you will find like something like this, K2 tog, P2 tog, so purl 2 together and knit 2 together. And then it would say repeat whatever is between these little stars. So that is exactly what you will do then. And this might come in very different formats, but that is something you quite often see. Okay, that is it for this video. Whew, that was a lot to get through. I do really hope that after watching this video you feel more confident if you've been thinking about getting into knitting, or maybe thinking about tackling that project or pattern that you've been having your eye on. So hopefully this will give you the confidence and the courage to go out there and do it, because I know that you can. It's been done before. You can totally do it. And who knows, you know, when I release this pattern, which is called the Pride and Pearls cardigan, which has all of these different stitches and lots of things going on, maybe you're going to be able to do that even if maybe you haven't done that many knit projects yet, because I mean, a pattern is exactly that. It will help you to create these beautiful things, and somebody has thought about, you know, the sizing and everything like that, so you can just enjoy the process. Thank you so much for watching this video. I would be super curious to hear your thoughts on this, if there's something I missed, because maybe there's something crucial that I didn't address. Maybe there's another video that has to be made. I am thinking about making some videos with more, again, like tips and maybe for beginners. I would also be very curious to hear if there's something specific that you're thinking about. So let me know in a comment below. And as always, I would love to just connect with you and chat. And if you want to see more of what I'm working on, you can always come and say hi. I'm over at Kutovakika over on Instagram. All right, take care, happy knitting, and see you next time. Bye!